encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. We're inviting the life of Christ into our lives. Welcome to Today with Jesus. My name is Robert Hadfield.
And my name is Dan Winkler. Thank you for joining us again today. We enjoy coming into your hearts and into your lives on a weekly basis. This, I think, broadcasts every Tuesday, and we're thankful that you have decided to join us once again for a great study of the greatest man to ever live, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, looking at his life from the book of Mark. How about it, Robert? You doing well today?
I'm doing well. So people have been responding to our survey. You know, we released that last week, and you mentioned that we're in their lives, you know, and we're some people told us that we go on their walks with them.
Really?
Yeah. Some people say that we exercise with them. That
no wonder
explains
I'm so tired.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Why I am so out of breath. It's just.
Oh, but boy, aren't we in great shape?
Oh, yes, that's right. This hour every Tuesday really takes it out of me.
Oh, well, I think there's some that even join us on YouTube, don't they?
They do.
And see the visual. So based on that, I'd like to say to you, good looking shirt you got on this morning.
Hey, I appreciate that. There was just something about the plaid that was really drawing to me today.
I looked at that and I thought, look at there, he's got plaid on, and it's almost like the very same shirt.
I tell you, I like it. We've been.
Well, we have class, don't we?
That's what it is.
That's it, man.
Yes, that's yes. How do you put it into words? I think that's how you do it.
You know what? I think it's time to get away from this nonsense and get into our study.
All right, I'm ready.
Are you ready? We're going to be today in Mark chapter 13. I think this is the most intriguing chapter of the entire Gospel of Mark. And it actually, the events are actually recorded in all three of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. And we're studying this particular chapter under the heading, The End of an Era, because Jesus is predicting the end of Judaism and the city of Jerusalem as the capital of Judaism in this entire chapter. So the end of an era. You know, I'd like for us to introduce our thoughts before we get into our two major questions, Robert, by stepping into the mindset of a Jew in the days of Jesus. And I would like to suggest that to the Jew in the days of Jesus, Jerusalem held a very special place. And then I would like for you to just share with us some thoughts on Judaism in general and how Judaism, the whole Jewish economy, held a very special place in the mind and heart of a Jew in the days of Jesus. Jerusalem. How did a Jew in the days of the Old Testament and the days of Jesus, how did a Jew think of Jerusalem? In Psalm 48, read with me verses 1 through 3. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great God. Within her citadels, God has made himself known as a fortress. They saw Jerusalem as the very city of God. And I love these words, holy mountain, beautiful elevation, the joy of the earth, the city of God, where God has made himself known. So to a Jew, Jerusalem was extremely important. You also find in Psalm 50, verses 1 and 2, the mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting out of Zion. The perfection of beauty, God shines forth. God shouts from Zion, and the Holy Spirit through the psalmist actually calls Zion, a synonym for Jerusalem, the perfection of beauty. So in Psalm 48, it's called a beautiful place, the city of God. And in Psalm 50, it's called the perfection of beauty from whence God speaks. Jerusalem was very important to the mind of a Jew in the Old Testament times, in the days of Jesus, who lived under the Old Testament, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
How about Judaism? How did a Jew of Jesus' day and even a Jew in Old Testament times consider the overall Jewish economy of things?
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a lot of pride associated with being a Jew in the Old and New Testaments. I think we really see that in the New Testament when the New Testament church is struggling with that. The fact that the gospel is going to go to the Gentiles, and of course that's a little on further in the history than where we are in Mark right now. I think about how a Jew was born a Jew. To be a Jew, I mean, I guess you could be a proselyte, but even that moniker was sort of a step down. If you were a Jew, you had to be born into a Jewish family, tracing that lineage and the genealogical tables back as you could. I think about the physical mark that a male Jew in particular, of course, would bear, a sign of that covenant, the circumcision. And
Right.
that was given all the way back when, you go all the way back to Abraham and others, but all
That's
the way
right.
back to that point. And then as Moses is delivering the law and he's establishing a covenant with the people, the Hebrews writer gets at that in Hebrews chapter 8 when he says, I made this covenant with these people, going all the way back to the time when they were delivered from the Exodus. I think a good illustration of this might be Paul in Philippians chapter 3, or maybe a parallel passage to that, when he's saying, if you want to talk about pedigrees, I can tell you my pedigree.
Oh, there you go.
And he describes himself in Philippians chapter 3, circumcised on the 8th day. And I'm told literally that means I'm an 8th dayer. I'm not a proselyte. I'm not an Ishmaelite. I am a born Jew of the people of Israel. So I can trace my lineage all the way back to Israel or Jacob himself.
Yeah.
And so that was a point of pride. Of the tribe of Benjamin, he says, a Hebrew of Hebrews in that day and time. Maybe that meant I'm not a Hellenist or a Greek-speaking Jew. Maybe it meant I'm a Jew who is still able to read Hebrew, a skill that was vanishing at the time of when Paul wrote this to the church in Philippi in the first century.
Mm-hmm.
I just raised Philippians chapter 3 to point out this is what Judaism meant to that culture. And this is what was obviously had been done away with at the time that Paul wrote this. And he'll exalt Jesus. He says, I count all that but laws for Jesus. But as we're here in Mark chapter 13, that law has yet to be nailed to the cross. All of that is still coming. And I think the book of Hebrews really sets that up for us, if I can transition there. Because
Yes.
in Hebrews chapter 8, the writer says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant. He's quoting the Old Testament here. When I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them out by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. They did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I'll put my laws into their minds. I'll write them on their hearts. I'll be their God. They shall be my people, and they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me. From the least of them to the great, I'll be merciful toward their iniquities. I'll remember their sins no more. A citation from Jeremiah 31 to 34. The Hebrews writer is in the midst of making a really neat argument about all of that. But that old covenant that existed going back to after the Exodus, even before then, but when it was made the law given through Moses. And then we proceed from that point, and we see that they were unfaithful to that covenant. And that at least is a little bit of the background to what leads us to Mark chapter 13 today. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So you have here Jesus speaking as a Jew to his apostles who were Jews, and they were in Jerusalem. They had just come from the temple. And as you watch Mark chapter 13 unfold, Jesus begins to address thoughts relative to Jerusalem, the city, and Judaism as a whole. And his whole thoughts from the chapter kind of fall under the capsule of this episode's headings. There will be an end to the era of Judaism and to Jerusalem as the capital city of God. That's Mark 13, Matthew 24, and also Luke chapter 21.
Yeah.
So as we have those introductory thoughts in mind, what Jerusalem and what Judaism meant to the mind of a Jew in the days of Jesus, we are prepared now to begin our study of Mark chapter 13, where Jesus begins to address an end of all of this. And let's begin, if we don't mind, Robert, reading Mark chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Read those two verses for us.
Sure. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down."
Okay. Now, with those particular passages, what did Jesus say? Look at this. One stone will not be left on top of another. And he's talking about the stones that resulted in this great edifice, the temple, coming into existence. So let's think about those words and begin to ask our two questions today. What can I learn about Jesus? What can I learn from Jesus from Mark chapter 13, a chapter that deals with the end of Jerusalem as the capital city of God and the end of Judaism as the means by which we had fellowship with God. The end of all of that, Mark 13.
Hey, Brother Dan, by the way,
yeah.
before we move too far, if I could just interject, they must have balked at that, one stone upon another. You know, Josephus tells us that each stone, the temple was built of hard white stones, each of which was about 25 cubits in length, 8 cubits in height, 12 cubits in width. If we convert that generally, we don't know the exact measurement of a cubit, but that rounds out to something like 38 feet long, 12 feet high, 18 feet wide. If you go over there today, I've seen videos of this, you can still see some of the stones going back to the era of Herod's temple that are still there. They're littering the ancient streets right up against the ancient city wall. You can see they're ginormous. They're huge. I was going to say ginormous. I don't know if that's a word, but anyway.
Can you spell it?
No.
If you can't spell it, you can't use it.
Okay, sorry. That's why I changed. Anyway, these are huge stones. And to make a claim like that had to leave the disciples just in bewilderment.
Right.
What are you talking about?
What you're saying is they were big, B-I-G.
Yes, they
right?
were. Yes, sir.
They were big.
That's right.
So you're not thinking about a little brick that's made like our houses are made of.
Yeah.
You're talking about just a huge stone that many of them making up the temple.
And I think that speaks to the point that if you topple that thing over, this is a definite thing. That this is something that is huge that has come through and happened and is signaling, as we say, the end of this era.
Right. In fact, we're going to see in verse 3 in just a minute how the apostles took them aside whenever they were away from the temple, and they said, in essence, "Explain yourself." What do you mean by what you just said? It was really a shocking observation to them. So let's ask this question today. from Mark 13. What can we learn about Jesus? And just from these first 2 verses of the chapter, I think we can learn a whole lot about the heart of our Lord. Here's one observation, and then I'd like for you to piggyback on it with another observation, if you don't mind.
All right.
One of the things I see from these first 2 verses of the chapter, I learn this about Jesus. He was unimpressed by things. Now, you see that in the word that Jesus used to describe the buildings, in contrast to the word the apostles used to describe the buildings. If we go back to verses 1 and 2, the apostles said in verse 1, "Look, teacher, look at this, Lord. Look, teacher, what wonderful stones." And then again, what wonderful buildings. And the word that they use for wonderful on both occasions is a word that was used for something indigenous of a country. It was a term used for exclamation in reference to absolute independence. The idea was unique. Look at this, Lord. There's just nothing else like this anywhere. Look at these stones. You can't find stones like this anywhere. Look at these buildings. You can go city on top of city and you'll never find anything like this anywhere in all of the world. That's what they were saying in essence to Jesus on this occasion. Look what wonderful stones, look what wonderful buildings, but to prove that things, Jesus was unimpressed with things, watch his response. In verse 2, Jesus said to them, "Do you see these great buildings?" And he didn't use the word the apostles used twice for wonderful, protopos. He used the word megas, megaphone, mega church, big, large. Do you see these large buildings? They said, "Look at how gorgeous all of this is. You can't find anything like this anywhere." And all Jesus said was, "You see these big things? You see these big stones? You see these big buildings?" And then he made this statement. "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." You see all these big buildings? They're going to crumble. Jesus was unimpressed by things. It reminds me, Robert, of what he said in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, when he said, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures where?
On earth.
On earth, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven." They were giving so much emphasis to earthly stones and earthly buildings and what they deemed unique and wonderful. And Jesus was unimpressed because he knew there was a city, if we could coin the words of the Holy Spirit through John in Revelation, New Jerusalem was far, far more magnanimous and magnificent than anything they were looking at there. He was unimpressed by things. I learned a lesson there about Jesus, but I can learn from Jesus there, just to segue for a moment. I can learn that when it comes to my value system, I don't need to be grounded either. I need to be making certain that I seek things that are above. Why? Where Christ is, to use Paul's words in Colossians 3, 1 and 2. So that's one thing I learned about Jesus. He was unimpressed by things. And I need to feel that way too, and not see how much I can amass in this world, but how many treasures I can lay up for me in the world yet to come.
Mm-hmm.
How about yourself? What can you learn about Jesus?
Well, it sort of in tandem with that is that Jesus was countercultural. You know, here are these people. Look how magnificent this is, and you know everybody's got to respect the temple and how wonderful it is. Of course, it wasn't all that it was in Solomon's day. It had been, rebuilt after being destroyed once and remodeled, virtually rebuilt one other time. But look at how magnificent, how amazing this place is. As we said at the beginning, they took a lot of pride in that. And Jesus' response is rather interesting. The Jews, for the Jews, the temple, that whole temple complex, Jerusalem itself as a city, that was, as you said, the capital of this nation, and it was the destination. I mean, it was a place where people would come from all around. We've talked about this a little bit going back to Jesus' birth, and on that occasion, in the earlier parts of the Gospel of Mark, and how there were some obligations to come and present in those specific times. In Psalm 129, the statement is made that the person who hates Zion ought to be put to shame and turned backward. The ESV translates that, and I kind of like that.
Yes.
You don't bemoan, you don't talk bad against this particular place. It was the place where the temple was. It was the place where people would flock to come for different feasts of different kinds. We're right now in this section in the week of the Passover, leading up to that. And we'll be reading soon in the book of Mark about Jesus' observance of the Passover, the people that were packed around there at that specific time, because there they are here in the city of Jerusalem. Other feasts as well, Exodus 23, Deuteronomy 16, you got to present yourself to the Lord on certain feast days. And of course, as the Old Testament system, shall we say, evolved a little, and David and, of course, Solomon built the temple. Solomon built it. David wanted to. And it was located there in the capital. And so this became the place where all of the people would flock to come. Jesus says, not one stone is going to be left upon another. Jesus doesn't respect the institution just for an institution's sake. That is to say, it's not just that this is something old. It's not just that this is something magnificent. It's not just that this is a location where thousands of years of significant biblical history have taken place. The most significant event that will happen in that location is yet to happen. We'll read about that before we get to the end of Mark. But here Jesus says he's looking at it more through the spiritual perspective. I think to your point a minute ago, here is the representation of, the capstone of, the departure of God's people from what the covenant originally ought to have been. They've rejected the prophets. They've rejected now the Messiah himself, and their punishment is coming. That's the tone of the chapter. And that's sort of the countercultural approach. The disciples must just be beside themselves, and that Jesus would even speak this, and that'll lead to a couple of very interesting questions that they'll pose as we make our way through the chapter.
Jesus was countercultural. Can that say something to you and me on how we need to live our lives?
I think so. He says, don't be surprised if the world hates you, because it hates me. And so obviously, if you follow me, it's going to hate you too. John 7:7, John 15:18. Paul says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed.
Right.
We're supposed to go against the grain.
John said, don't love the world.
That's it. Yeah.
Nor the things that are in the world. So we need to live a life that's countercultural as well, and not let culture dictate, how we are to live. Mm-hmm. I think we dealt with that a little bit in our episode last week, didn't we?
Seems like
we
it.
Talked about the Herodians.
I guess we can't overemphasize that point, though. It's one of the major tenets of what it means to be a disciple, right? We're following him instead of the world. It's
interesting that, in Exodus 23 and then in Deuteronomy 16, where they're talking about the three major pilgrimage feasts, the Lord told Jews that they were to engage in these feasts in a place that he designated.
That's right.
And the place that he designated was Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And yet here Jesus is saying, to emphasize the point that you're making, Jesus is saying there's not going to be one stone left on top of another stone in all of these buildings. And so the place that God had designated for the Jewish pilgrimage feasts wasn't even to exist anymore, according to Jesus. So he's making some major predictions here, isn't he?
Absolutely. And we ought to mention, I mean, if we can just piggyback that in Joshua 23, Joshua indicates that the things that the Lord your God has promised concerning you, all of those things have come to pass for you. Not one of them has failed. Of course, he's talking about how God was going to take care of them through all the different stages of the Exodus and the wilderness wandering and preparing for the conquest. But I think we could look forward in that. Here's that Old Testament system here. These are these pilgrimage feasts. This is the designated location in Jerusalem. There's a definite end that's in sight, even as Jesus looks for. He said it's going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner than later from the time that Jesus spoke those words.
Right. Well, I think that helps us step into our next question and watch the chapter completely unfold before us. And here's the question: what can I learn from Jesus today? And what I'd like to do, Robert, is just kind of put our finger on the pulse of the chapter. It's a very lengthy chapter, of course, but I think if we just put our finger on the pulse of the chapter and watch it unfold uh, very carefully, it begins to make so much sense to us. As we look to verse 3, we find the apostles asking three questions, and then verses 3 and 4. And then in verses 5 through the end of the chapter, Jesus answers those three questions. And that's Mark 14 or Mark 13. Yes, Mark 13. And same thing as you study carefully, Matthew 24, Luke 21, you have the apostles asking three questions and Jesus responding to those three questions. So here is verse 3 and 4. Why don't you read those for us?
Sure. Mark 13, 3 and 4. As he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?"
Okay. Now, they're with Jesus privately, and verse 4 gives us these three questions. I have to actually go to Matthew 24, verse 3 to see the third question. But watch the questions unfold. Tell us, number one, when will these things be? Now, he had just predicted the fall of Jerusalem. There's not going to be one stone on top of another. Mm-hmm. And so they ask him, well, when is that going to happen? When will these things be? Question number 2. And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? How can we know it's about to happen? So they ask a time question. When will all these things come to pass? And they ask a sign question. What sign can we look for that will prove this is about to happen? Now, if I go back to Matthew's account in Matthew 24, verse 3, we find they actually had a misunderstanding. They thought that Jesus was talking about the end of time, that he was talking about when he was going to come again and destroy everything, and we all go to heaven. And so verse 3 of Matthew 24, tell us, when will these things be? Time question. And what will be the sign of your coming? Sign question. And of the end of the age? An end of time question. Now, what Jesus does, beginning in Mark 13, verse 5, is he begins to address all three of those questions sequentially. He addresses the time question, when's going to happen, the sign question, what you can look for that says it's about to happen, and then the end of time question. And if we keep that breakdown in mind, the chapter just flows so beautifully, and it becomes very easy to understand. So, Robert, go back again for me to verse 3. What was the time question? What did they ask?
Tell us, when will these things be?
Okay, one stone will not be left on top of another, talking about the temple, the beautiful buildings of the city of Jerusalem. When's that going to happen? Now, Jesus begins by addressing that time question. And he does so in verses 5 through verse 13. Now, I won't read the entirety of the context for the sake of our time, but I just want you to see how he constantly references uh, the factor of time. For example, Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray." Verse 7. When you hear, when, time question, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. That's not the time. You come down in verse 8, and he says there'll be earthquakes in various places, there'll be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. That's not going to be the time. It's just kind of the beginning of the time coming into play. Verse 11, and when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious. There was going to be a time when the apostles would be tried, uh, as well as followers of Jesus. Verse 13, you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. When? End is not yet. It's just the beginning. When? Endure to the end. He's talking about when this was going to happen, the time question. So he's saying you can look for various things. There'll be wars, rumors of wars. The earth will quake. That's not earthquakes, but the earth quaking because of armies coming for wars and end of wars. There's going to be famine, the result of the way cities were sieged during times of wars and rumors of wars. And these are things that were going to be taking place, but that's not the end yet. There's just going to be those things coming into play. And when those things come into play, the end's not yet, it's the beginning. So he answers the time question. The time question. There are certain things that are going to have to come into place. A foundation is, so to speak, needing to be put in place before all of this happens. There'll be wars and rumors of wars. The earth will quake under the feet of armies marching and their cavalry. There'll be famines that are caused due to war. And you will be hated by those who come to war, and endure. Endure. The time question. I believe if we were to go back to Matthew's account, Matthew even tells us that Jesus says to them that this was going to happen in the age, in the lifetime of the apostles themselves. So what Jesus is predicting, Robert, about the destruction of Jerusalem is something that was going to happen in the lifetime of the apostles in the first century.
He even says that in our text down in verse 30, this generation will not pass away until all these things, going all the way back to even where you're talking now, have taken place. So
yes, yeah. Excellent point. This generation, it's going to happen in your lifetime. I think that's important to remember because of some of the things that people want to do with this chapter, along with especially Matthew 24 and some of the figurative language we're going to come up on here in just a minute. They make that say a lot of stuff that Jesus never really meant. And it's important to keep that in mind. This generation, all this is going to happen to Jerusalem, Judaism, in your lifetime, Jesus says to the apostles.
I've noticed
Time
that
question.
sometimes we do the same thing with Mark 13:13, for example. He who endures to the end will be saved. And I think
Yes,
in context, he's not talking about be faithful unto death like Revelation 2:10 says, even if it means death, even as what that passage is talking about. But here he's saying you endure these trials. In context, the
yes,
persecution that's going to come, the wars, and it's going to be kind of a scary time, lots of things happening. You stay faithful to me during that specific time. But he's not talking about the end of time yet.
correct.
Yeah,
So what you're telling me is he who endures to the end is not saying you'll be saved when Jesus comes again
that's
if
right.
you endure to the end.
Hmm.
Okay, excellent point. He's talking about the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Judaism, and all the persecution that was going to come to Christians and Christianity in that segment of time, in the lifetime of the apostles,
Hmm.
and those who endure to the end of the destruction of Jerusalem and Judaism
Hmm.
will be saved. And it's not talking about their souls being saved in heaven,
That's right.
as we're seeing here in just a minute. It's talking about they would be saved in from the destruction of Jerusalem and all that
Hmm.
was going to happen to the Jews in that city when it fell.
Yeah, and can I just say, I think sometimes we fail to appreciate the majority of our New Testament is actually in that period of time that Jesus just explained. The persecution that's coming by the hands of the Jews. You think about it, the writings of the Apostle Paul are in the 50s and 60s. The destruction Jesus is talking about happens in AD 70. I mean,
Right.
it's coming, and even Paul, I think, points to it in some verses, in his writings. But all of that Paul endured on the missionary travels, the imprisonment of Peter and John early on in Acts chapters 3, 4, and 5, all of that is a fulfillment of what Jesus told them was going to happen here in Mark 13 and the parallel passages. So maybe it helps us to get our Bible timeline, our New Testament timeline in place to see that, yeah, what Jesus said was actually happening there.
Boy, that's a wonderful observation in keeping with the specific words of Jesus in verses 10 and 11.
Hmm.
The gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. That's
Yeah.
what Paul did.
Hmm.
And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious. That's what happened to Paul and his company and many other Christians preaching the gospel back then. Do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. That's what happened to Paul.
Yeah.
Paul spoke as the Spirit gave him utterance, as did Peter on the day of Pentecost. And his revelation, as he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, was not the revelation of man, the wisdom of man, but the revelation and the wisdom of the Holy Spirit. So, excellent observation. The persecution that Jesus is predicting in Mark 13, verses 3 to 13, is a prediction that transpired before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 during the ministry of Paul and his contemporaries. Excellent thought. A time question. The fall of Jerusalem and Judaism is going to happen in your lifetime, Jesus says to the apostles. Now they asked a second question, a sign question. Read again verse 4 for me, Robert.
Sure thing. So tell us, when will these things be?
Time
And
question.
what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?
Sign question. Now he's answered the time question in verses 5 to 13. He's now ready to answer the sign question. And he does so in our context in Mark 13, verses 14 through 31. And he gives various things for them to look for that would indicate this is the fall of Jerusalem and Judaism. This is about to happen. Here's what you look for. Now, verse 14 begins his answer to the sign question. When you see the abomination of desolation, pause for a moment. Robert, if you would take the time to turn to Luke 21, verse 20. In just a minute, I want you to read that one for us to help us understand this abomination of desolation. We don't talk that way. I mean, my lands. When you see the abomination of desolation. Well, what did he mean by that? He goes on, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountain. When you see the abomination of desolation, that's when it's time to run. It's about to happen. When's it going to happen? In your lifetime. Well, what's the sign that says it's about to happen? When you see the abomination of desolation, run, flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, not enter his house to take anything out. Don't go downstairs and pack. Get out of there. It's about to happen when you see the abomination of desolation. And he says that frequently here in verses 14 through 23. He says, in those days, verse 19, there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now and never will be. When you see the abomination of desolation, run, get out of the city, take flight, because a great tribulation is about to happen. The sign question. What did Jesus mean when he referenced the abomination of desolation as the sign indicating the beginning of the destruction of Jerusalem and Judaism? Read Luke 21 for us, verse 20, Robert.
But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near.
Now, it's desolation, the abomination of desolation. Know that Jerusalem's desolation is near. Luke's account says, Luke 21:20. What indicated the desolation, the abomination of desolation, the fall of Jerusalem? What indicated, what sign were they to see proving that it was near?
They're surrounded by armies.
Surrounded by armies. And in AD 70, General Titus of the Roman Empire surrounded Jerusalem, lay siege to Jerusalem. Josephus talks about this a lot, and all of the tribulation and the hunger and the awful things that transpired inside the walls of that city while Titus lay siege to the city. And it happened in AD 70 when the armies of Jerusalem under General Titus surrounded the city. That's the abomination of desolation, referencing AD 70 and the coming of the Roman army against Judaism and Jerusalem. When you see the army of Rome began to circle Jerusalem, get out of the city. Get out of the city. The fall is about to happen. And it's in that same context that it talks about how that verse 20, if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. I believe in Matthew's account, he's referencing the Christians that were inside the walls of the cities of Jerusalem. And for some unknown reason, there was a very brief moment of time. Titus came with the army of Rome. He encircled and laid siege of the city of Jerusalem. And for unknown reasons, he backed away briefly and gave a little small window of time for some inside the city to escape. And I believe it's Josephus that says there were no Christians that actually fell to the siege of Jerusalem whenever they came and once again gripped their city in the siege of the army. So look for the army of Rome to begin to circle the city of Jerusalem. That's the abomination of desolation that proves the sign of the time is here. Robert, there's a section in Mark 13. It's in verses 24 through 27, where Jesus uses some odd terminology, some we'd say, with great respect, we would say he uses some weird word pictures. We call it in various religious circles apocalyptic or figurative language in reference to the fall of Jerusalem. And I would like for you to read verses 24 through 27 for us. And let's listen to this figurative language. Bear in mind now, we're in the contextual flow where the apostles have asked a time question: when's this going to happen? A sign question: what sign can we look for that tells us it's about to happen, the fall of Jerusalem? And then an end of time question that Jesus is going to get to in just a minute.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the contextual flow. He's answered the time question. When this happens, when this happens, when this happens, the foundation of the time is being laid. Now, when you see this, the abomination of desolation, the encircling of Jerusalem by the Roman Empire, the Roman army, that's when it's about to happen. Now he uses this very figurative language with this contextual flow of thought continuing. Read it for us.
But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven.
Now he starts off in verse 24 with this figurative language. By the way, figurative language. Sun darkened, moon not giving its light. I think one translation says moon, it's either Matthew or Luke's account, or I may be thinking even about this same type of terminology in Revelation, where it says the moon will be turned to blood, and the stars falling, and then the sun coming in the clouds, and the angels gathering the elect. This is all figurative terminology in reference to something that was going to happen. Look at verse 24 again. In those days, in that generation, in those days after that tribulation, the tribulation, verse 19, that was going to take place when Jerusalem was encircled by the Roman army. In those days after that tribulation, certain things are going to happen. And then he uses this figurative terminology. I like to cut to the end of verse 25. The powers will be shaken. And the powers will be shaken is figuratively illustrated by the sun not shining, the moon not giving light, the stars falling. It's referencing the powers that be of Judaism, the religious authorities of Judaism in Jerusalem were going to be shaken. Judaism as it had been known would be known that way no more when Jerusalem was to fall. Jerusalem was to fall as a city. Judaism as a whole was to be no more as the way people came into fellowship with God. It was all going to be shaken up. Yeah. Then he says, you'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. This, in its context, is not talking about Jesus coming at the end of time when the universe is to be destroyed. It is figurative terminology. When Jesus comes figuratively in the destruction of Jerusalem, he will figuratively be sending out his angels to care for his saints inside the city, and they will be able to escape, as he referenced all the way back in verse 20. So if you put it all together, this figurative terminology is just Jesus giving a figurative, flowery way of suggesting Judaism is going to fall. And what I have been talking about as me being the only way to God is going to begin to come into play. The destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of the whole Jewish economy, predicted by Jesus by his answering their time question. It was going to happen in their lifetime. And the sign question, it was going to happen when Rome encircled Jerusalem and caused great tribulation to take place inside the city walls with the fall of the city and the Jewish economy.
Mm-hmm.
The time question, the sign question. Let's hasten on very quickly. If we go to Matthew's account in Matthew 24, verse 3, they asked an end of time question as well. They had a misunderstanding. They thought Jesus was talking about the end of the age. And so, in our context, as in Matthew 24, Jesus begins to address their misunderstanding. And in Mark 13, verses 32 through the end of the chapter, he begins to address their end of time question. And he says, but concerning that day, the day that will announce the end of time, the end of the age, my coming to destroy the universe. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angel in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And because nobody knows when Jesus will actually come to judge mankind and call an end to the universe, he goes on with the warning, be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. They did know when the time of Jerusalem's fall would take place. He told them it's going to be in your lifetime. They did know what to look for when the armies of Rome encircled the city of Jerusalem. That was the sign. But they did not know what time the end of the world would take place. And so they were encouraged to always keep on guard, or I think Matthew's account says, be ready, be prepared. Mm-hmm. So I stepped back from all of that, Robert, and this is what I learned from Jesus. He addressed their time question, their sign question, their end of time question. And I learned by putting my finger on the pulse of this chapter that there has been a change in the way we have fellowship with God. You were born into fellowship with God under Judaism. When you were born a Jew, immediately you were a part of his kingdom. You were a part of God's family because you were a Jew. If you were not born a Jew, you could become a proselyte, a Gentile that went through various processes to become a Jew. But if you were born a Jew, you were born into fellowship with God. Jesus is predicting in Mark 13, as well as Matthew 24 and Luke 21, an end of Judaism in the fall of Jerusalem, and thus man coming into fellowship with God in a completely different way. And that's why Paul could say in Romans 9, 7, and 8, I think some translations say they're not all Jews who are Jews. They're not all in fellowship with God simply because they come from a Jewish lineage. And I think Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to 19, if we had the time, would really be of benefit to us, where Paul is actually saying, because of Jesus, we have peace with God. Through him, Jesus, we have access to the Father, not because we were born a Jew or not. And he says, he came to make one new man, thus making peace, the church, one body, the spiritual body, the church, so that Jew and Gentile alike in this one new body, the church, could come into fellowship and have access to God. So Jesus is predicting a change in the way we come into fellowship with God. It's not because of our physical heritage, our being born a Jew or not. It's rather we are born again. We become members of the spiritual body of Christ, the New Testament church, made possible by the death of Jesus Christ. It's an intriguing chapter, and I know I spent a lot of time there because we just kind of put our finger on the whole chapter. But I'd like to take a breath and ask you
I think you deserve a breath now, you know?
Take it, if you would take it from there.
Yeah.
And I would like for you to please talk to us a little bit more about how that we learn this lesson from Jesus. We also learn from Jesus that we do not and we cannot know when Jesus is coming again. Kind of flesh that out a little bit for us.
Hmm. Well, there's a decided change when you come to verses 32 to 37, as you just mentioned a minute ago. And you see that some in even the way that Jesus is referring to this day that he's talking about. In verse 32 says, concerning that day or that hour, no one knows. Previously he's referred to the days, Mark 13:20, those days, verses 17, 19, and 24. The signs and things that he just mentioned with reference to the destruction of Jerusalem was going to happen over an extended period of time. And there would be several things that would have to happen before that, including the gospel being preached to everybody who was alive in the known world at that time. Paul
all
said,
in preparation for that day.
all in preparation for Jerusalem being destroyed in AD 70. But now we have a shift, and we're referring to one specific day, a specific moment that will end all of time. And Jesus says, okay, I've just given you all these signs about the destruction of Jerusalem, but so you know that that day is not the day that will end all of time, I want you to understand that while you can know the Jerusalem destruction is impending, that those signs are coming, no one knows, verse 32, no one knows when that day that's coming in the future is going to happen. Not the angels in heaven, not the Son, only the Father. And so there's the point. We don't know, and we cannot know when Jesus is coming again. Listen, if what he's talking about in 32 to 37 is the same thing as what he talked about in verses 3 to 31, then he's contradicting himself. Because in the first part, he said, you can know, and here's how. But now in 32 to 37, he said, you can't know. No one knows.
Yeah.
And so in response to that, rather than wasting mental effort and in the name of different, processes and hopes, trying to determine when that day is going to be, Jesus says, here's what you do. And he does it in the form of 4 imperatives in 33 to 37. First, he says, be on guard. Now, he's already told them, even with the destruction of Jerusalem, there are going to be false teachers and even people who claim to be the Messiah that are going to pop back up after Jesus is gone. And Jesus says, be on guard against those kinds of folks.
Good point.
Don't we have even more of that happening with reference now to the end of time? People predicting when it's going to happen. I've even heard, Brother Dan, people in 2020, as much as we've sort of jokingly described 2020, and we got this global pandemic, and the hurricane season has been just unusually active, and on and on and on. People say, oh, these are signs of the time. Here's Jesus' response. That day and hour knows no one. Be on guard. People are going to say some weird things, and there's no truth in it. The other 3 imperatives are actually the same. The end of verse 33, and then verse 35, and then verse 37. Verse 33, keep awake. Verse 35, therefore stay awake. Verse 37, stay awake.
That'd be something for you to use on Sunday morning, wouldn't it?
This is what I'm preaching this Sunday. You got to stay awake. The Lord could return at any minute. That's what. So there's this phrase. There's this phrase. I want to see if you've heard it. They talk about being woke to something. Have you heard this phrase?
I don't know that I have.
And people are saying, stay woke. I've heard a lot of it in the context of the racial discussions that we've had. Another aspect of 2020, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is I'm aware of what's going on. I may be even aware of how I can change to help problems or whatever. It's not a bad phrase, I guess, as far as what I know about it. But I guess that's kind of what Jesus is saying here. Be alert, be aware, and continue to see life through a spiritual lens that helps you to realize it's not about putting all our stock in what we see here. It's about hope that will one day be made sight, one day be fulfilled, faith that will one day be made sight, and living in this life with that spiritual perspective and in preparation for the next life. Here's what Jesus does tell us. The end is coming. And so we shouldn't pretend as though it isn't. What he does then further tell us is, but we don't know when it will be. And so preparation, being on guard, staying spiritually awake rather than falling into spiritual sleep, lethargy, apathy.
Right.
We've got to make sure that we keep alert and remain faithful.
I believe in Matthew's account, Robert, that
Mm-hmm.
Jesus actually used an illustration. He talked about to distinguish between the two. He talked about the fig tree,
Yeah.
and here's this fig tree, and you know when it bears fruit, you know that this season. And he says, if you look for the signs that I just gave you, you can know for certain that the fall of Jerusalem is going to come, is right around the corner. But when it comes to that day, the day that I'm going to come for the end of the world, nobody knows. Big contrast
Right.
there he makes. And then we often talk about the parable of the faithful servant
Yeah.
who is watching, making ready and being prepared for when his master returns. And then we even are more familiar, I'm sure, with the parable of the 10 virgins, and all of those, and the parable of the talents. These are stories that flow from what Jesus was saying in reference to what you just said. Nobody knows when I'm going to come again at the end of time. So be awake, be alert, be ready, be prepared. And then he gives these 3 stories to emphasize the fact that we need to stay awake, be prepared spiritually for the time that he does return. Excellent observation.
Right. And can I just add, but before we close this up, I know time's running against us as it always is, but the disciples were confused about the issue on the front end of this. And I think that's why in Matthew's account, they equate the destruction of Jerusalem with the end of time. And as you've shown, Jesus systematically and sequentially answers each of those 3 questions. And I think there are a lot of people in our modern day that step away from the chapter maybe with some questions still because they haven't heard it explained as simply as it really is. They've heard it in a clouded explanation, in air quotes.
Right.
But you know what? As the disciples were hearing this, I think that they came away from it on the other side with clarity, and in part because of the figurative language that you walked us through a moment ago with reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. We say that's figurative, and our listener might think, well, that's convenient. If you can't explain something, you just say it's figurative, or whatever. But if you know your Old Testament and you read like Isaiah 13 and the destruction of Babylon that Isaiah pronounces, he uses the almost verbatim, the exact same imagery to refer to the fall of Babylon. Egypt, Isaiah 19, the same thing. The fall of Egypt, and Israel's enemies around them are going to fall. Now that's Isaiah's message to Israel in that time. And Jesus uses that same prophetic, apocalyptic imagery of doom with reference to Jerusalem. And you better believe the disciples knew exactly what that meant. Isaiah 19, by the way, even depicts the Lord coming on a cloud and all of that. So we may think, well, that sounds a lot like the second coming and the end of time. The disciples in Jesus' day didn't think that. All right, so Jesus comes around and says, these are signs you can know. Here's signs that you can't. Be prepared. You can't know when that day's coming. Be prepared for it. And I think they walked away from that. While they didn't know exactly how it was all going to happen, I think they walked away from it crystal clear in terms of the concepts. And I just wanted to say that to kind of wrap that up a little and say we ought to have a little clarity on this too. And while we don't know exactly when it's going to take place or exactly what it's going to look like, a few weeks ago in the Bible class here, we had a neat discussion about how the resurrection takes place and, all of that. I don't have all the answers to every bit of that. We've got a lot of details in 1 Corinthians 15 and other passages. Yeah. But the point is, here's what I can walk away from Mark 13 knowing I ought to be prepared. I ought to stay awake. The Lord is going to come and take his people home. And there's going to be a judgment and a punishment of those who are wicked at that time as well. Mark fleshes that out. Matthew's account is a little more detailed in Matthew 24 and 25. And that's the takeaway as we think about our chapter for today and our discussion for
Wonderful
today.
thoughts. Thank you for taking us back to Isaiah and helping us with that figurative terminology, because I think you're right. A lot of times what happens is we have individuals or we read it and we see this figurative terminology and it's talking about the coming of Jesus figuratively,
Mm-hmm.
and we immediately think literally. And so we try to go back in here and we try to make all these signs of the times reference his second coming,
Mm-hmm.
and we just misunderstand the entirety of the contextual flow
Yeah.
by doing
Yeah.
that. So your comments from the book of Isaiah and the fall of Babylon, the fall of Egypt, were just outstanding in helping us understand that apocalyptic paragraph in Mark 13.
I
Very
like that.
helpful.
Apocalyptic paragraph. That's good
Apoc-
stuff.
Say that fast 3
I
times.
don't think I can't even spell it, so I shouldn't use it.
Okay.
Today with Jesus
Oh,
releases
man.
every Tuesday from TheLightNetwork.tv. All the archives are available at TheLightNetwork.tv/TWJ. And as we mentioned at the top of the program, we are actively beginning to plan Season 3, the Lord willing, of Today with Jesus, and we want you to be a part of that. Take the survey that is linked in the show notes of this episode and last week's episode, and it's just a 7-question. It's averaging less than 5 minutes for the people who have taken it, and we've heard from people all across the United States. We want to hear from you, particularly if you have a question. Next season is Q&A. What would Jesus say? We've got some really great questions so far, but we want yours. And so go to the survey that's linked in our show notes at TheLightNetwork.tv. Look for Today with Jesus, Season 2, Episode 13, and click the link so you can take the survey and also help us to know how we can improve Today with Jesus. Today with Jesus, I learn about the end of an era. There have been some applications that were more limited to the time of that generation. Jesus said it himself. Those things would take place during the lifetime of the apostles whom were standing there on the Mount of Olives when Jesus discussed that. And then their follow-up question about the end of time has to do with us. And certainly we've taken a lot of applications from both sides, but we like to end every episode. And by the way, the surveys indicate, Brother Dan, that the listeners enjoy this aspect of the program.
Oh, no.
I just want to say that. We like to end every episode with
Oh,
a parting challenge, something to take with us
okay.
from today.
Well, thank you for letting me know that.
You're welcome.
I didn't take the survey, but I've looked at it and it's just so simple and it's very helpful.
That's right.
And I'd like to put an exclamation mark behind what you just said, and how that first of all, we really appreciate those that listen to our podcast and the kind words that you're sharing with us. And we really want your help. We're very interested in your questions. I'm tempted to put one down there, and I want to specify Robert to be the one to answer it.
Oh, great. Wait a minute. The rules are the hosts can't take the survey. I'm sorry.
What now? Oh, okay.
I just made that rule, but anyway. So let it be written, so let it be done. Okay.
Okay. Oh, me. Okay, for our closing challenge of the day, we've seen that the apostles knew in their lifetime Jerusalem and all of Judaism was going to fall, and it was what to look for: the armies of Rome encircling Jerusalem. But they also were informed you cannot know when Jesus was to come a second time at the end of time. And it's on that note that I would like for us to close with a challenge. We turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. And the Holy Spirit, through the Apostle Paul, bears reference to the coming of Jesus and our not being able to know when it's going to happen, but our needing to be ready for it. It says, you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. The coming of Jesus is going to be something that is extremely sudden and something that we don't know is happening on this particular day. There's no sign for which to look. It's just going to happen, and we need to constantly be ready for that to take place. As a result of that, we often sing these words: there's a great day coming, a great day coming, a great day coming by and by, when the saints and the sinners shall be parted right and left. And then the question we sing: are you ready for that day to come? Are you ready? Are you ready? We continue to sing. Here's the challenge that comes from those lyrics. I want to change the word "are you ready" to "aren't," and make the question a question, more a declaration of excitement. Instead of, hey, are you ready? Let's change it to saying, aren't you ready? When you think of all that's going to happen when Jesus does actually come, there's the sound of the voice of the archangel Michael. There's the trumpet of God being blown. There's Jesus that we'll be able to see for the first time ever. There's the judgment of all of mankind. And if we are forgiven, we'll talk to Jesus not about anything but all the good in our lives, because the bad has been forgotten. And then we'll hear the words, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Man, with all of that in mind, aren't you ready? That's the challenge. If you're not, we need to make sure that we do what the New Testament tells us to get ready. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, brother. Thank you all for being a part of our discussion today. If you have questions, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. thelightnetwork.tv/TWJ. Until next time, thanks for being with us. May you live today and every day with Jesus in your heart and in your ways.